Hi, and welcome back to the NCS podcast, current series. This is Lauren Kaufman. I'm a neurointensivist at Temple University in Philadelphia. And today I'd like to welcome onto the podcast authors from a recent current Story of Hope article. So we have Cameron Cooklick and Dee Mahanes. Dee works at University of Virginia, and she was part of the care team while Cameron was in the hospital. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for
Yeah, of
having
course.
us.
So I think before we get into what the experience was like for you, Cameron, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about like what your life was like before the accident? This was in September of 2022. I think you're 30 years old, right?
I was just about to turn 31, so I'm 32 now. I guess I could start with my job. I have a pretty interesting job. I travel a lot for work. Pretty much every week I'm going somewhere else. I work for a heavy equipment company called Unbroken. And so I operate the machines, I coach operators, I go through maintenance, I do a little bit of social media marketing, kind of a jack of all trades for this one machine that cuts down trees, removes trees. So it's pretty niche, but I love it and it takes up a big part of my life. So always on the road. I really enjoy that. I like traveling, seeing new places, meeting people. So it's fun.
I also think you're super, super, super active, like way more active than that your average like younger person. So just tell us a little bit about kind of your athletic hobbies, the things you
Yeah,
participated in.
sure. Yeah, I guess ever since I was like maybe 2021, running has been one of my biggest hobbies. And it's kind of, come and gone over the years, but I like marathons, ultra marathons. Whenever I'm like bored or in a weird place in life, the first thing I think about is like what marathon or race or kind of like endurance feat I can do next. Beyond that, I enjoy hiking, climbing, I definitely like being outside and staying active. So and before this job, I was a professional tree climber for a residential tree care company, so that was active as well. Yeah, I mean that played both in a part of my stay in the hospital, as we'll talk about, and the recovery, just that sense of being active and having a purpose in my physical life.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So now when the day that you had the accident where you sustained the traumatic brain injury, we were celebrating your brother's birthday. No, your brother's wedding had just occurred, right?
That's right. Yeah, him and his wife got married during the pandemic, and so that was kind of a close knit, just families only kind of thing. And they're both very social people, big friend group, and so they finally had the reception that they had been planning for quite some time. And yeah, it was after we celebrated their marriage that I got into a really bad scooter accident and woke up a month later.
And do you actually remember the day where you had the scooter accident, or do you just remember the wedding, or what was your last like memory?
Yeah, thankfully I have some good memories of the wedding. The last thing I remember, actually, my family, we like to, put our arms around each other's shoulders and kind of sway to Billy Joel's Piano Man. And so that's kind of the last thing I remember, which is a kind of a touching thing to have like this moment of like love with my family, all my brother's friends, this extended family. But yeah, after that, I don't know anything. I've been filled in, but that's the last thing I remember. So I'm really thankful I have memories of their wedding because it was such a beautiful day and evening. And I'm also thankful that I don't have the memory of riding the scooter that night because, knowing all the trauma I sustained, even without that memory, I don't think that would help to add that onto it.
Yeah, for sure. And so now we're kind of getting into the piece where we're going to have Dee fill in some of the details. So Dee, why don't you tell us what your role was in Cameron's care and talk a little bit about what kind of brain injury he had?
So I'm a clinical nurse specialist who focuses on critically ill neuroscience patients. And so I work directly with patients and families, providing education and support, and also provide clinical expertise to the nurses and the other team members who are involved in the care. And we certainly have a large multidisciplinary team here in our neurocritical care unit. So I was involved in a number of different aspects of Cameron's care. In terms of his injury, Cameron had a severe traumatic brain injury. He had an initial Glasgow Coma scale of 6, and Glasgow Coma scale is the score that we use to determine and delineate whether somebody has a more moderate injury or a more severe injury or a mild injury. And Cameron's injury fell into the severe category. He had multiple bruises throughout his brain and also had a skull fracture down at the bottom part of his skull. And so it was a pretty significant injury. We used a lot of different treatments to try to decrease the pressure within Cameron's skull, because one of the problems with a traumatic brain injury is that there's swelling afterwards. And so there are a number of different treatments that we employ to help decrease that swelling and help optimize the patient's chance of recovery.
Great. And I know you end up having to use a lot of sedation and manage those pressures. And when we have patients that are in the ICU that come in with a brain problem, oftentimes they develop some other complications in other parts of the body. And I think that's the situation that Cameron was in. Is that right?
It is. When Cameron was first admitted, we knew that he had the severe traumatic brain injury and that we needed to reduce the pressure in his brain. And so we were using things like sedation, heavy sedation, concentrated salt solutions to try to pull fluid from the brain and decrease swelling. He was on the ventilator and was on the ventilator from the time of his accident for about 4 weeks. And then we also used aggressive management of temperature to try to decrease the demands that his brain had, and medications to help support blood flow to the brain. So there were a lot of different things going on, just that were brain-focused care. In addition, Cameron, when he had the accident, had some bruising to his lungs. And we suspect that he also got some contents from either his stomach or something down into his lungs, because he developed a pretty significant pneumonia during those first few days in the ICU. And so he had those issues that we were trying to manage. And after about a week, we had gotten to a point where things were more stable. And then Cameron's oxygen level began to drop. And when we investigated that, what we found is that he had actually had some clots that traveled to his lungs from another part of his body, most likely from his legs or the veins in his lower extremities. And so as we were looking at that scan, we also realized that he had what was a really scary complication, which was that he had a very large blood clot that ran from the main vein in his abdominal area up and actually came very close to his heart. And not only was it large, but it was also moving. And so that increased the risk that pieces of that clot could break off and travel to his lungs and cause further damage to his lungs. So that was a pretty scary complication.
Yeah, certainly. Now, one thing that I was really interested in hearing more about is in the article, the Currents article, you mentioned the collaborative rounding process and how involved Cameron's family was with the ICU team. So I just would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. And I think that extends to the treatment that we provided for the clot as well. We actually worked with Cameron's family and spoke with our interventional radiologist, and were fortunate enough to be able to actively pursue removal of that clot, which I really think provided the best opportunity for Cameron's full recovery. His parents were a big part of that discussion about how we should treat that, whether we should just use blood thinning medications or whether we should try to remove the clot, recognizing that there was some risk of dislodging additional clot. And ultimately, we made the decision to move forward in hopes of returning Cameron to his very active lifestyle, which requires good lung function. And fortunately, we were able to successfully do that. Now, Cameron's parents were incredibly, incredibly involved in his care throughout. We have a very active interprofessional rounding process within our ICU. The attending physicians, the residents, the advanced practice providers, the nurses, our respiratory therapist, our pharmacist, we all round together and talk about each patient every day. And Cameron's parents, we invite families to participate in those rounds. And Cameron's parents consistently participated in those rounds. And not only did they participate, but every day his mom would bring a new story of Cameron and a new picture to show the team on rounds. And so at the end of rounds, it got to the point where we would ask, okay, what's today's picture and story? And she would show us a picture of Cameron doing something very Cameron-like, climbing up in a tree or spending time with his family. And I think that really allowed our team to get to know Cameron as a person and an individual, and gave us an idea of what we were trying to get him back to. it was incredibly helpful.
Awesome. Now, I mean, Cameron, we've just talked a lot about what was happening, and clearly you don't, and hopefully don't have any recollection of that. But what point do you actually remember waking up? Like, what's your first memory? And where were you? Were you in ICU, in rehab?
Yeah, so this is a very strange experience to try to communicate because it was so surreal and so outside like your normal experience. So the first thing I remember and experience, so to say, was a series of like very intense dreams, maybe like 5 or 6 really intense dreams. None of them made much sense. None of them had a lot to do with the hospital, but slowly bits and pieces of the hospital kind of infiltrated my these dreams that I was having. And I can't remember like a first clear cut moment where it's like, oh wow, I'm in the hospital. It was kind of like the slow like growing awareness from like a dream state to kind of piecing together what happened. And then yeah, by the time I was sent to the step down unit, I would say I understood what was happening. And then definitely by the time I went to inpatient rehab, yeah, I would say I was more or less with it. I still had a lot of way to go with recovery and the psychological aspects of the recovery, but by and large, I would say I don't know. Once I went to the step down unit, D would know kind of timeline wise what that is, but once I went to the step down unit, I knew what was going on.
And as someone that is like so active as you were, like, how did you cope with now being like a patient, like very sick patient in the hospital?
Yeah, well, yeah, and in inpatient rehab, I uh I loved going outside. I got to be pushed around in a wheelchair outside. My physical therapist and I would go on walks, and she kind of got the sense that I was like ready to explore just how physical I could be at that time. So I was like not only walking upstairs, but trying to like walk quickly upstairs, stuff like that. Yeah, it was when I was in inpatient rehab that I had this idea. It's like, man, I got to, get back home, get back to work, and run a marathon. That was like when I that idea kind of was born in my head. It was like, how cool, like that's going to be like the main signal of my recovery once I get back to that hobby and complete a marathon. So,
We'll talk about
uh,
that in a little bit. But before we get there,
yeah.
what was your support network like? Who was supporting you and how did they help keep you motivated?
Yeah, well, definitely my family. Like Dee was saying, my parents were able to stay in Charlottesville while I was at the hospital. So they were coming and visiting me every day. They were part of rounds. And then when I woke up, just they were with me as often as they could be, which was, I couldn't imagine having gone through this without that experience of having my parents, my brother, his wife, just coming to visit me as often as they could. That was very, very helpful. Couldn't be understated how helpful that was. But also like coworkers, acquaintances, people send like messages, notes, donations, and all that stuff. I woke up and looked around the hospital room and saw flowers and cards and pictures, and that was just really amazing. You hate to be put in a bad situation to kind of think through how close you are with people and what you mean to them and what they mean to you. But that's kind of one of the silver linings of going through something like that that's so traumatic is you realize who's there for you and everything like that. So it really was a community effort. And yeah, I obviously couldn't have done any of it alone. So
And aside from all of your
very
family
humbling.
friends that were supporting you, is there anything you remember the people either in the hospital or rehab that did to help make you feel better, help motivate you, like things that our listeners can try and do for our patients that might have a positive impact?
Mm, I don't know, just being with the person. Like when nurses and doctors would come into the room, I enjoyed having somebody's presence there with me, especially when I was still kind of loopy and confused about what was happening. One of the funny memories that stands out is I couldn't drink water or eat food obviously for the first few days, and so I was allowed to have 5 little chisels of ice every hour on the hour. I would like joke around with the nurses and doctors to try to get more ice and quicker. And so, it helped to like have some people to joke around with too. Once they realized like I was well enough to joke. I remember Dr. Lunardi, I told her, I said, can't you use your clout to give me some ice cream or some more water? And I think she still owes me that ice cream. But yeah, I think just like any kind of support of just being around a person who's in a state like that, having a comforting presence and and just being next to them, even if you're not talking, just being around them and being available was really helpful.
And in your article, you mention the importance of the ginkgo to you and kind of your family. And I know they were in the courtyard in the hospital, but can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was still kind of too early for me to form coherent memories, but I've been told, and I kind of vaguely remember it, that on the way to the step down unit from the ICU, the nurses or doctors I was with kind of took us on a detour to the hospital's courtyard, and the courtyard was lined with these ginkgo trees. And that was the first time I felt fresh air. And I guess I pointed up and kind of tried to mumble a few words, and I was just like staring at the ginkgos. And then beyond that, my parents would walk every day from the hotel to the hospital, and the streets in Charlottesville were lined with ginkgos. And so it just became this meaningful symbol of hope and recovery and resilience that after a month in a coma, my first like moment of myself, so to speak, was pointing at a tree, and trees are just a big part of my life. I've climbed trees for fun, for work. I love being outside. I love being around trees. So I imagine for my mom seeing that, it was like a monumental moment. And even now, it's kind of a beautiful thought. And so we all have ginkgo leaf tattoos to kind of commemorate that idea.
When you said we, who it's you and who else?
Oh, all five of us.
Everyone in your family?
My parents, Corey and Mary Kate. Yep.
No one from the neuro ICU wanted to opt for that tattoo?
They're more than welcome to. I'd love to see it. Also, I think Dr. Lunardi and I are going to run a marathon at some point we were talking about. We'll see if that happens.
You know, you started mentioning as you were getting more with it and more lucid, you were getting into rehab, you're wanting to challenge yourself. What were some of the bigger challenges for you as you were transitioning back from rehab to home or just getting back into your daily life?
Yeah. Yeah, just like major anxiety. It's like infantilizing, like you're kind of brought back to being a kid again. It's like one memory that stands out is my parents and I went to like Trader Joe's. Like I still couldn't go back to work, and I was still in outpatient rehab. And so they were thinking of ways to like help stimulate me. And so they took me to Trader Joe's and let me push the cart. And I remember being so like stricken with anxiety at the thought of like just being in this crowd and losing sight of my parents. Or we went to a movie, and I was the one that ordered popcorn, and like in my head on the line to order popcorn, I was like reciting the line because yeah, it's just like being a kid again. I felt like I'd never been in public before, and just that level of shock and anxiety is obviously disconcerting and not very comfortable. So that was one of the big challenges, is trying to keep a positive outlook and knowing that it's not going to be permanent. Like the effects of a TBI are pretty nasty: brain fog, tiredness, anxiety, depression. But if you have a positive outlook, it helps. But it's obviously not forever, and so getting into that more positive mindset was a challenge sometimes.
I mean, it sounds like your positive outlook certainly helped you because I think you were back to work, what, 2 months after getting home from rehab? Is that about right?
Yeah, I got back from rehab November 5th, and then I think late December I went to my company's work party to kind of get reintroduced to everybody. And then early January I started to go back on work trips. And even that, like my first work trip was to a company that I had met only recently before I got hurt. And so they heard about my accident, and they're very supportive, sending good well wishes the entire time. And I basically told them, hey, I'm not going to be helpful at all, but can I please just like come visit and say hi to kind of get my feet wet in this whole traveling routine again? And yeah, they were more than happy to have me out. And so, yeah, I was easing back into things come January.
And then it was about 6, 7 months later, you ran your first marathon since the accident, right?
Yeah, yeah, it was pretty cool. It was April 1st, and it was in Charlottesville. It was really awesome. I went online at some point when I first got home and looked up like the marathon schedule in Virginia and saw the one in Charlottesville, and just in complete, I don't know, just so lucky and meaningful that it was in Charlottesville, which is where I was in the hospital. It was the perfect time too, so it gave me a few months to train. And first I had to go on walks and all this stuff, and then go on jogs with my dad while he watched, and then finally going on jogs alone. And And so it was literally perfect timing that it was April and in Charlottesville. And I've run marathons before. That was by far the most meaningful, special. Family was there to meet me. We went to the ICU after, and yeah, probably like the number one thing I've done in life, I think, in terms of like personal impact. And I don't know, it was a special moment for
I
sure.
mean, that's so impressive. And I mean, Dee, what was the impact like on the ICU like staff having him? You came back immediately after the race, is that right? You went through the finish line and then went to the ICU.
Almost right after. Yeah, I showered first for him.
I think that my first instinct is just that it gave us hope, right? So Cameron and his family walked back into the ICU, and it really represented all of the efforts that we had put forth and that his family had put forth, and then that Cameron had put forth to really try to fully recover from what was a very severe traumatic brain injury. And I everybody wanted to be there. Everybody wanted to see Cameron. It was a Saturday and people came in on their days off. And so we were just all really grateful that they came back and shared his recovery with us and have continued to share his recovery with us. So I think it gave us hope as a team.
Well, it sounds very special. Cameron, I always ask people if they feel like they're back to their normal self. Sometimes that involves there being like a new normal for some people, but it seems like you're kind of back to living your life as how it was before.
Yeah, so certain things are different, and I don't know if they'll ever go away. Like if I, forget a story somebody told me or misplace an item, like I immediately, my first reaction is always, is this because I have a traumatic brain injury? But then I remind myself that I always forgot things, I always lost things. But that additional layer of like second guessing myself is new, I can never like live in bliss like in the way I used to about like being forgetful or whatever, as in before the accident. But aside from like my moment to moment experience, I would say I'm back to normal. I have like healthier habits now than I used to. So I think in some ways, it's like I'm back and then some. I definitely value like my health a lot more in a way that I didn't. I don't disregard small things like sleep and exercise and diet. I think before I got hurt, I was just kind of I don't know. I didn't take any of it too seriously, and now I do. So some things are different, but in a good way.
I mean, we really appreciate you sharing your story. I think the last question is going to be, do you have any advice or words of wisdom for other people that are going through similar situations?
Yeah, I think if I found out somebody had a TBI, I would tell them just to like a recent TBI where they're still feeling the effects of it. I think number one would just be like be kind to yourself. Like in the same way that I just mentioned that like if I lose something, I think is this because I have a TBI? Yeah, that's not like really good self-talk. You want to have like healthy, positive self-talk. And in the first few months after a TBI, you want to be positive that it's only going to keep getting better, which is actually, it can be a fun thing to watch your own recovery from the inside. That can be a positive thing. Be patient and then don't beat yourself up. Like there's gonna be times that it sucks, but you know, you get through one day, get through the next, and eventually you're a few weeks behind it, a few months behind it, and eventually you're at that new normal, and you look back. And I've talked to other people with TBIs, and I think for myself and for the people I've talked to, there's a sense of pride at having overcome something so challenging, especially a TBI. You can't really describe it. You can't. Nobody really knows what it's like until you have a TBI. It's like it's not a group you want to be a part of, but when you are a part of it and when you feel like you've gotten to the point where you overcome it, there is a sense of, wow, my body is resilient. My psychology is resilient enough to get through that. Then the other stuff that I deal with in life isn't that serious. But yeah, it's just a matter of like powering through that first year. And that's just a matter of patience. So that's what I would say. Be patient and have a good outlook. Gets better.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you both for joining. We'll make sure we include a link to the article in the show notes. To check out this or other Currents content, head to currents.neurocriticalcare.org. And as a reminder, NCS offers free CME for select podcasts. You can listen via the NCS Learning Center and complete a short survey to receive your credits. Otherwise, you can access the NCS podcast wherever you get your pods. And don't forget to add us to your favorites.